In the next panel, the worst-case scenarios of the future of publishing will be discussed. The moderator of the discussion will be Felix Debranti, Head of International and Institutional Relations at BL Press.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Please welcome our guest speakers at this panel discussion, which will focus on future threats, challenges, and opportunities of the publishing industry. Kevin Anderson is a consulting director at Publikálás, a seasoned digital media leader with over 2 decades of experience with some of the most respected news organizations in the world, including the BBC and The Guardian. As a consultant, he has helped organizations including Al Jazeera, CNN International, and Singapore Press Holding Media to develop and execute digital content and audience engagement strategies. As a consulting services director, he and his team work with Publik's clients to optimize their products so that they achieve their audience and revenue growth goals. Thank you, Kevin, for being here. Jorge González Hayarza is a co-host at the Uncommon Decency podcast on Europe and a contributor to the European Conservative magazine. His writings on economic and foreign policy have featured in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the American Conservative, and elsewhere. He holds a Bachelor in Economics from University College London and is working towards his Master's in Political Theory at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales à Paris. Thank you for coming. Antonio Omoloni is the editor-in-chief of La Gazzetta della Iberosfera and the founder of La Iberia. Before returning to Spain, he was a communications specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank, a researcher, analyst at the Vice Presidency for Latin America and the Caribbean of the World Bank, as well as an advisor at the Embassy of Spain in Washington, D.C. Please welcome our guest. Thank you for being here. So, I would like to start with a provocative question which suggests a rather negative picture of the future of the traditional publishing industry. So self-publishing and citizen journalism are becoming increasingly popular, creating more and more intense competition in the publishing sector. Meanwhile, the dominance of big tech has caused a significant decline in digital ad revenues for these traditional publishers, which fundamentally threatens their survival. On top of all this, ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence software, has also arrived in the public domain, signaling the arrival of AI-driven technology in the media sector as well. So with all this in mind, don't you think that the downfall of the traditional publishing sector is very imminent and maybe inevitable? Anyone who would like to?
Oh, I guess I'll kick it off. And I first have to admit that I hate writing conference bios, so I actually had ChatGPT write most of my bio. So that sets out my stall. I think if I can be practically philosophical for a moment, I think what this highlights is sort of some of the paradoxes of digital media. So everyone has spoken about how easy it is to launch a digital publication. So the barriers to entry are much lower. You don't have to own a broadcasting license or a television station. You don't have to own a printing press. You can publish through social media channels or a blog or Instagram or TikTok. However, with the barriers of entry coming down, the paradox is the revenue that you can generate from digital media versus some of the traditional media is also lower. So it's easy to launch, but more difficult to sustain. So that's been the real challenge for digital media, and I kind of frame that. I call it, I refer to it as the attention economy. It's not original to me, but it basically says content, and when you think about it, music, video games, film, books, news, information, whatever, that's no longer scarce. Time and attention are scarce. And that completely refactors how we approach media and the kind of business models and even some of the ways that we grow audience. Now, when it comes to ChatGPT, I think that's just an example of one of the latest disruptive technologies. But one of the things with all of digital is that there's the challenge, but then there's the opportunity. And what we're seeing both at Publikálás, but also for the Reuters Institute, what they're seeing is AI is flowing through media. It's supporting personalization, which is increasing the relevance of content to audiences. It is driving automated tagging and content management. It's driving dynamic paywalls so that the offers are uniquely tailored to each individual and their activity, so that if you have a bundle of digital offers, you can give the right offer to the right person at the right time and have a better chance of converting that person to becoming a paying member of your audience. So I think we'll talk about all of these, but you can focus on the threat, but the challenge for us as media leaders is really to find the opportunity in all of it.
I guess we'll sort of work in this direction. I mean, as a contributor to several publications, I obviously dread the advent of artificial intelligence and how that can sort of produce content on its own. But I'm going to try to give a bit of a rosier outlook and point towards some of the areas where I do see opportunity and hope. I actually think, rather than all of the phenomena that you've listed, Felix, I actually thought that the last nail in the coffin of a moribund, terminally declining journalism industry was none of the things that you mentioned, but rather Substack. When I saw the advent of Substack, when you write for magazines, you're aware that magazines occupy this very sort of precarious niche between writers and readers, right? But nothing stops those two groups from getting to one another, sidestepping the magazine, right? The magazine's the intermediary, but just like crowdfunding have totally eliminated the mediators in those industries, so can Substack eliminate, or so I thought, can eliminate magazines as the mediating sort of institution between writers and readers. Actually, Substack is doing very well. It's a very popular platform. There's people who are making real money on it. You have to be really good, but it proves that yes, indeed, the role of magazines was always precarious, and there's nothing that can stop platforms in the future from disrupting the industry even more. But actually, you know what? Felix, when I reflect on your question, I come around to the realization that actually, despite all of the hardships that Kevin has outlined, the magazine industry is just pulling through. It's weathering the storm. I mean, yes, some magazines are dying. I actually write for a magazine in the UK called The Critic, which is a spin-off from an earlier magazine that predated The Critic that was called Standpoint, which died essentially when one of its main donors, one of its backers, pulled out, really parted ways with the editorial board over, this backer thought that the magazine wasn't focusing enough on sort of cultural issues. So magazines die, they can come back alive, new ones also spring up, but I think on the whole, magazines are weathering through the storm, and they're doing just fine insofar as they can offer a unique product that is at once informative and entertaining. I think that is the secret formula that I'm going to keep belaboring and hammering throughout this panel, is you have to offer something special and unique that is both entertaining and informative.
Yes, and I think that's very important. We will talk about the importance of the different revenue streams later. But before going on, Antonio, what do you think about the possibility of downfall?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. You asked if the downfall is imminent, and I think it already happened, but it's not bad news, not at all. It happened years ago, and I don't think too much about ChatGPT and all those technologies, because I think probably readers are not paying or wasting their time in reading that kind of content. They look for analysis and quality, and they look for writers, certain people they follow. So it may change it all, but I think the great change came a few years ago when the newspapers turned to paper, to online versions. And now it's really hard to to find a 100 people newsroom anywhere in the world. Just public newspapers or the huge ones we all know are able to gather all those people, and it's even harder to find a new newspaper or magazine which are just where more than 100 or even 10 people work for. There are a few examples, not too many. In Spain, we had one in the last couple of years, which is El Debate, where Jorge Soler works, and it's been a huge surprise. Around, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but around 70 people from scratch is crazy, but that's not normal. So is that a bad thing? No, that's a good thing. There's an opportunity for anyone who is willing to spread some ideas, especially those that are against or away from the mainstream media. It's quite easier, it's quite cheaper to establish a newspaper, a magazine, to do it with quality, to give different content to the audience. There's no point in competing to give break news to the audience, to compete with Twitter. There's no point in that. You may be really good, you can be a reference in certain topics, but nobody, when something happens, almost nobody will surf on your homepage just to see what happened. Everybody will go to Twitter, and then they may end up landing at your page. But you will never cover every topic, so what you can offer is time. I mean, you can offer analysis, you can offer quality, and you can offer something different and in depth. That also applies for paper, I mean, for hard copies. Whenever you give quality, and we all see it, there are new publications all over the world, hard copies, good content, good paper, and they are rising in the last years against the odds, against everything, and they are working because it is not about time, it is not about quickness, it is about depth. So all in all, I think it's a good opportunity. It happened, and especially at this side of the world, away from the mainstream media, the mainstream topics, the mainstream opinion. We are better than we used to be because we have the opportunity to establish media, to do it, and to grow organically from scratch.
Yes, and just to stay here and focus a little bit more on La Gazzetta della Iberosfera, what are your recent experiences in terms of digital growth? Do you feel that you are reaching more and more people, readers every year, or is it a challenge to expand in the online space due to increased competition?
Well, it's been, yesterday was mentioned, it was discussed several times, that controversy, I don't see it a controversy, but that controversy between serving the audience or serving the readers or serving the advertisers. And you can call me a romantic, and you'll be right. I think it's not about, I mean, it's up to any outlet. Business is business, and some outlets are just there to sell news, to share articles, and that's it. But if there's something behind, some ideas you want to defend or you want to spread, I don't think it's about serving the audience or serving the advertisers, it's about serving the truth. And once you serve the truth, there are millions out there in every country who are willing to aiming to find outlets, newspapers, televisions that say what they say at home, what they say with their friends, what they say when they are comfortable with the people they trust, which are probably the majority in our countries. But it is really, really hard to find it on the press, on television. So as long as if we will, serve the truth, we'll find audience, and it happens. And behind the audience, after the audience, we will find advertisers. There are not so many advertisers as common citizens that are willing to find those ideas defended, but there are so many. There are many in every country who are willing to support in an indirect way those outlets who say what normal people say, probably they won't be willing to fund a newspaper or a magazine from the beginning. Of course, probably they won't be willing to tell it, but they may be willing to just put some ad on it and help it. I know it's not easy. I know sometimes it's really hard, especially in some countries. Mine is a good example of that. But I think it's about serving the truth. And speaking about La Gazzetta, we turned to paper to online like almost 10 years ago. Well, I joined just a few months ago, but now we I think we perfectly know that it's about defending the truth and about probably saying what other media doesn't say. That's another opportunity. That's easy as well. There are many topics most of the media just don't cover, like gender, racism, migration, the virus, the pandemic, the vaccines. They don't talk about that. Sometimes there are millions waiting for that. And there's another opportunity to show, well, probably I shouldn't say that, but we are growing a lot just by sticking to the plan and trying not to serve the advertiser, but the truth.
Yeah, thank you. So La Gazzetta turned to the digital space very early, but PugPig also plays a very important role for media companies working with large clients such as Al Jazeera or CNN. Kevin, can you explain us how your technology works and how can you support the digital transformation and the future goals of media companies?
Well, PugPig is a platform that we build apps and websites and digital archives for magazines, education publishers, membership organizations that have publications. And our tools are set up so it doesn't matter where you're at in your digital journey. If you even just have PDFs, you can send those to us, and we've got technology that transforms those into either replica editions or interactive HTML. If you've got an existing CMS, you can just send us your feeds, and we can turn that into an app really quickly. We can generally do proofs of concept in a few weeks. But I think the other thing is, and I think all the panels have alluded to this, it's not just the publishing stack that we support, it's also the revenue stack. So we have integrations with advertising services and also subscription management services. So you heard a little bit about Piano yesterday, and they're one of our technology partners that provides a lot of outstanding support for us and for our clients to turn casual readers into paying subscribers. And I think the other thing, and if I can just talk a bit broadly about the industry, is we also, through that support, Piano supports registration. And one of our large clients, The Independent in the UK, has a strategy called A2K, Anonymous to Known. And I think one of the major pivots in digital transformation is understanding that a mass anonymous audience is almost impossible to build a sustainable business on. So The Independent, even though they're not really leaning into paid subscriptions, they've realized that if they can convert people from anonymous to known, so basically what's called a registration wall, that's another intermediary step. So I've had a few people in conversation say, well, how do you get people to pay for news and information? I said, okay, 10 years ago, we basically had hard paywalls or metered paywalls. That was the initial phase in reader revenue. Now we've got the registration wall, where you've got information about that person. So you've got better targeted advertising because you know more about that reader. You can also market to them. You can get them to sign up to newsletters. So there's a lot more sophistication in terms of, to use a marketing term, the conversion funnel, and transforming these from unknown users who just kind of come and leave and you never know who they are, and they might see an ad impression and maybe there's a click through, so maybe you get a few cents or florins for that. But then when you move them down the funnel and they register and you get a newsletter and then you can market to them and they become a paying subscriber, then it's not about the size of your audience, it's really about how much you know about your audience and how easily you can convert those people into paying subscribers or members. And I think that's what our platform helps people achieve.
Thank you. And the competition in the podcast genre is very fierce these days. So almost all media outlets, public figures and companies launch their own podcast channels, making it very difficult to stand out from the crowd. Can you share how the Uncommon Decency podcast started and what has made it successful over the years?
Yeah. Well, so let me just take a step back and I'll kind of walk you through the backstory behind the podcast, which I co-host. In 2015, 2016, I went abroad to America, to Washington, D.C. I was an affiliate student at Georgetown University. And for natural reasons, I sort of revolved around the European crowd. And I met there my co-host and friend, Francois, who's a Frenchman from London. And Francois was Francois was struggling to, and so was I, to explain the intricacies, the complexities of European politics to an American audience. I mean, that year was a very important year in American politics. It was the year of the primaries leading up to the election of 2016, but it was also a challenge for us to kind of explain, and not just the sort of the mosaic of political parties in Europe, not just the complexities of the legislative process in the EU, but really the intellectual debates that sort of shape the old continent. We had trouble explaining it to an American audience in a way, to our American friends, in a way that they could sort of easily understand. So a few years down the line, I get a call from Francois, and he bounces off the idea that, listen, we should do a podcast. We should try to bridge this gap of understanding. We should make it easier for Americans to know about Europe. And we launched. Now, as you said, Felix, yes, competition in the podcasting genre is fierce, but you don't need to be Jordan Peterson to launch a successful podcast. This is, I mean, I think let me put it this way. I think there's a real demand and even a hunger for this kind of content. Podcasting has totally revolutionized the way we consume information via audio. I mean, just think for a second that in all of our countries, all of the legacy sort of established TV and radio stations have gone into the podcasting channel. They now release their content both through the waves and through TV channels, but they also release it as podcasts. So everything is on. You can learn about literally almost anything on whatever podcasting platform you use. I don't think there's, just kind of going back to your question, I don't think there's a secret one-size-fits-all formula for what makes a successful podcast. I think there are many different kinds of podcasts. There are news podcasts, right? News sort of podcasts that report on events, and there are podcasts who editorialize on those events. So that's a big difference. And there's also all kinds of different topics, and the formula for success varies greatly from one type to the other. So as far as our podcast goes, I'd like to think that we are, again, helping non-Europeans better understand Europe, and even Europeans as well, helping them grapple with the intellectual debates that have shaped Europe. So let me just give you an example. When we had Boris, who's sitting in the front row a few months back, talking about Hungary when the election happened, the last election happened, and Boris, you and the other guests weren't just explaining what was going to happen in the election, but really gave the backstory of how Hungary got to be where it's at in the moment through history, through sort of the post-communist period, and really taking listeners back and really kind of giving them the whole sweep of context and background for understanding the topic. So I'd like to think that what makes us special is the way we approach the topics, the way we choose the topics that we're going to cover, and the editorial angle we bring to that. Again, this kind of ties into my earlier answer, Felix, which is that ultimately mediators like magazines have to offer something. There has to be an editorial footprint that the reader values and is willing to go our podcast releases episodes every week, so we have a pipeline of episodes. Every week we have 5 episodes that we've already recorded that we could release, but we release one every day, every week on Wednesdays. And I think our listeners really appreciate that consistency as well, where we kind of operate like a newsroom where, we have editorial meetings, we come up with topic ideas, guest ideas, invite them, record it, and kind of going back to what Kevin says is that regardless of kind of where you put yourself in the regardless of where you put yourself in the market, there's a hunger for this kind of content. So that's kind of my story with podcasting.
Thank you. So I believe that achieving popularity and high professional standards is maybe only the first part of a successful media project. It is just as important to ensure the stability of the company, which requires stable revenue stream. So since the e-commerce is a booming industry these days, especially from 2020 and beyond, what do you think? Do you see the role of e-commerce, such as branded contents, PR articles, corporate advertising partnership, web shops, as an opportunity for media companies, or rather as a threat to editorial independence along financial interests? Kevin, maybe?
Sure. I think so. At PugPig, we recently released a State of the Digital Publishing Market report in December, and one of the things that was a top priority for the publishers that we worked with was revenue diversification. So, yesterday we sort of talked about advertising and reader revenue being sort of dual lines of revenue, but some of our publishers are saying, so what's next after subscriptions? And they're also aware that during an economic downturn or some economic headwinds, that both advertising and also the number of subscriptions might decline because people are now becoming aware of the number of subscriptions that they have. I know I'm reviewing mine in my household. So what we're seeing is a lot more revenue diversification, even in the digital space. So I remember I was doing some consulting for Reach, which is one of the major newspaper organizations, and they had a podcast that covered Welsh rugby, which is a kind of a national religion in Wales. And they launched a live event on the side, and they had revenue from day one because someone was actually paying them to host an event around Welsh rugby. And so you can have an extension of live events that extend from your digital properties. Another case study that we recently reviewed that was highlighted by Taylor Lorenz in the Washington Post, she was in the New York Times, then jumped ship, was a female-focused, women-focused podcast network in the US called Dear Media. And they're a podcast studio, and so they support the production of podcasts, but they also support what they called brand extensions. So last year, they launched 50 merchandising lines in conjunction with their podcasts that, again, are another revenue generator. So in terms of commerce, and I'll just touch on 2 more, not to take up too much time in the panel, but there's commerce media, which is the sponsored content. Then there's affiliate marketing. So that's why the New York Times, yes, they are focused on their kind of core business, but again, they're looking to other revenue lines, other businesses that they can buy often and extend what they're doing. So a few years back, they acquired a site called Wirecutter, just does reviews. And they get affiliate marketing. So every time you go to Wirecutter and you buy the hi-fi or networking router or vacuum cleaner, they get a cut of that purchase from Amazon. So there's affiliate marketing. But then there's also, commerce media, where again, they're actually selling products themselves. So, if you want a BuzzFeed branded hoodie or whatever that is. So there's a lot of revenue diversification. Some of it touches on e-commerce, other that's in events, other, local IQ that Gannett does in the United States, where they are actually selling digital marketing services because they have established themselves as digital marketing experts. So the great thing is that I think we've gone from 13 years ago, where there were untested business models, and digital seemed like the phrase in American English, you were trading print dollars for digital dimes, is now we're stacking those dimes into a credible business that can actually sustain a newsroom or a group of opinion makers at scale. So I think that's why we might be talking about worst case scenarios, but I'm generally pretty positive.
So what do you think, the question goes for any of you, what do you think, what is a healthy proportion of the different revenue streams for media companies? Because maybe over-reliance on a single source of income could be risky.
So for me personally, I think it's really a diverse set of income, so it's not necessarily a rigid proportion. The one thing, though, if there's anything that my career has taught me, through painful layoffs, is that every time the economy goes down, the layoffs start. So what I try to think about from a business perspective, even though I'm a recovering journalist, is so many of our revenue streams are cyclical, meaning that they track where the economy is going. Are there any revenue streams that we can have that are counter-cyclical, that can ride us through the rough waves of the economy and get us to the other side? So sometimes it is memberships or subscriptions. Again, you know, e-commerce is going to track down a little bit. Events get hit by a pandemic, so you always have. So I think it's really the diversity of the income streams and making sure that you're not overly reliant on anything. I mean, just one last thing, I was working with a publisher once, and they were incredibly reliant on Facebook, and this was 2016. And Facebook changes its algorithm, and they lose 40% of their traffic overnight. So whether it's audience development or revenue, I never want to have my business or my audience development plan so dependent on any one thing where a change in the economic conditions or in someone else's strategy can tank my business.
Antonio?
Oh, well, regarding the proportion of income and the sources, well, probably in my country, in Spain, the things are different from the US regarding the sources. And almost every outlet, big or not that big, has a sheer amount of that, a sheer proportion of that income from public funds. Maybe not directly, but through advertising. And it's really, sometimes when you are at the other side, it's harder to get them. So it's an uneven competition. Probably it happens the same in many other countries in Europe. But given our experience, and I always think, and I always speak from our point of view, I mean, from an outlet which is not mainstream, which is not supported by any government. So it's harder to find that and to think about that ideal proportion. I mean, from New York Times or from El País point of view, they may think and they may plan the right proportion. For me, in an ideal world, it will be, I would ignore public advertising, government advertising. Probably they wouldn't. But let's be honest, if we want to compete with them and if we want to share, we have our values, we have our ideas, we are publishing because we believe in something, usually, not just, it's not, I mean, just a few journalists will say they just want to tell what they see. And just a fewer will say that they tell what they see, because that's impossible. I mean, you tell what from your words, from your experience, so there's no objective telling of anything. So from our point of view, we have to accept and we have to be bolder when it comes to to fight with the same weapons our competency fights. I mean, El País is funded by tons of millions a year in Spain by the right-wing or left-wing government. It doesn't matter. So it's idle from our side to think we can compete with them by just looking at the private sector, looking at subscriptions, or just looking for people who are willingness to help us in a generous way. So we want to change that. We don't, probably any of us in an ideal world, every one of us will get rid of public funding per se. But if we want to get that, we want to reach more people. We have to be bigger, and probably to be at that level, we need to fight with same weapons and just to be frank.
Since you mentioned social media companies, how do you see the role of these huge companies such as Facebook and others? Are they becoming more and more like publishers since they are editing their content? So because of that, they are not just simply a platform providers such as AT&T, Telecom, or others. Could they pose a serious threat to the publishing industry in the future?
Well, what I'm interested in, actually, rather than the debate over whether Twitter is more of a medium or an actual publisher, what I'm interested in is what social media and big tech have done to the journalism profession. Because in my view, it has been totally revolutionized. I mean, there's a really thoughtful and really thoughtful journalist called Batia Ungar-Sargon. She works in New York, and she wrote a book a couple of years ago called Bad News, where she explains how, back in the days when when the print industry was unchallenged by online media. Reporting a story was something you took a long time to do. It was it gave you a lot of prestige within a newspaper, right? Going out and speaking to sources, building a report with your sources, and sort of coming up with a long form report that tells the story of something. That was regarded as the essence of journalism. But that essence now has shifted, where journalists are increasingly driven to tweet. They are no longer sort of crafting these exquisitely reported long-form stories, and now they're more about what's going to drive my traction on social media, what is going to make me popular, what is going to make me reach as many people as possible on Twitter, and that totally changes the profession. I mean, again, this is a bit of a white and black picture I'm painting, but it tells you something about where the trade has gone. And that's what I'm primarily concerned about. And I think that one of the issues that has been scarcely discussed at this conference is also the issue of talent, staffing. What is the publishing industry going to do to create enough of a talent pool of journalists? And I know Boris does a lot of this in his media school here at MTC, but we need more people like Boris to train would-be journalists, to equip them with the necessary skills and take them on, as you do, on trips or help them get interviews. We really need to, I mean, I know America has a lot of really good journalism schools, less so Europe, as far as I understand, less so Europe, but even in America, we need a big effort to promote talent and to make sure there's a pipeline of people that are going to be the future journalists of tomorrow.
So before going to the next question, we have just a little bit of time left. I would like to remind our audience that you can ask your questions using the Slido app or website using the code which is on the top of the screen. So when we talk about the future of the publishing industry, the debate is often about whether these companies can make up for lost print revenues and drive their offline readers to their digital platforms. But there are less talks on the growing online competition. I'm not talking about other publishers, but rather other entertainment media, such as video, streaming services, or gaming. Do you think that in the future, the real challenge will be to win the audience's attention from other forms of entertainment, as they are taking up more and more of users' time online?
So we were recently in our PugPig newsletter, we were covering a report by FT Strategies and Minute Technologies about the subscription economy. And one of the sobering things for me, as someone who used to be an executive editor of a newspaper, was when you looked at the league table, the list of subscriptions that people had, 68% of the consumers that they interviewed had a subscription to a film or television streaming service, 13% for magazines, 9% for news. So I think it goes back to the attention economy. We have to realize that we're competing against Xbox, we're competing against Netflix and Hulu and all of these other, not just for money, but actually for people's time and attention. And I completely agree. This is about providing something that's distinctive, something that provides value. So I think it is thinking about, and so I'm a member of the News Product Alliance, which is a group of product managers who work in the news space. And what we are trying to think about is not just about optimizing the products that we build right now, but thinking about all of the points that we can connect with audiences throughout their day, because it's a much richer place to do. And then instead of just kind of recreating what we do now, we actually are thinking about products that connect with people at different points of the day, and then they're more likely to become members, they're more likely to become subscribers. And when I listen to the media outlets here, I just want to pose one thing, and it seems to me that membership is much more of a better model than subscription, because what you're really selling is you're selling belonging. So I know this may not be, I used to work for NPR and PBS, don't stone me. But membership is a completely different model than subscription. Subscription is a transaction. Membership is belonging. And that's a different sales pitch, and it's a different thing. And I would say this, talking about counter-cyclical things and competing for attention, belonging is a scarce resource that everyone wants to have. And if you can sell that, if you can make people feel a part of something and capture a little value from that, you're going to be fine. And then not only, then you can pay talent and you can compete in the marketplace because you've got enough of a stable business to actually go out and hire those journalists and content creators who actually create the distinctive content. And then it becomes, to use a BBC term, a virtuous cycle.
So, Jorge, Antonio, what do you think about entertainment media and these forms? Are they a threat or?
Well, I'm just going to belabor what has already been said, but yes, these other, yes, there's this fierce competition for our attention, and the thing that really worries me is, I think of, for instance, my young brother. I have 3 brothers, but the youngest of them is 18 now. With every passing generation, it takes increasing effort, growing effort, to overcome the attraction of these gadgets that are all over our lives. These screens, these apps, these things that we use in our daily life that are constantly grabbing our attention, right? The apps that we scroll down. And I think of my younger brother, and I think he's going to have a tougher time than I did. And I already had, we already sort of lived this, when this whole process had launched, but my brother has no recollection of a time before the advent of social media, so he was born into this world, and I worry about him. I think that the ability of the young, the next generation to maintain their attention on a piece of journalism, to read through not just the first paragraph, but actually the entire piece, is something that really concerns me.
So before going to the Q&A, one last question. What do you think, what will be the single biggest challenge for publishers in the future?
I would say control, censorship, fear. At the same, in parallel, we realize there are more opportunities. It is cheaper, easier to create a media company. Bureaucrats also realize the same, and it is there's a growing control will from Brussels, from DC, from almost every government, because years ago it wasn't that common to the offer wasn't that wide. And now it is, what we call globalism, that conjunction of companies, bureaucrats, and media, established media, doesn't look very much willing to accept there is competition in the field of the ideas and the field of kind of politics and freedom. So I don't think that's the future, probably that's the present, but that's the biggest threat. We were talking about the social media platforms, and I wish they were publishers legally, because in that case they would be their directors, their CEO, would be accountable for what is published on those platforms, as we are in our outlets. So if that happened, that would be a sign that things are going in the right direction. But it doesn't look like most of the governments are willing to make that legal change and to consider social media platforms, which are huge and are reaching more people than any newspaper in the world, considered as an outlet, which they kind of are. So for now, I think it's clear the biggest threat is control and censorship, and of course, self-censorship, which is in a country like mine, it is in many heads, especially in the newsrooms. And it's hard to not only to write about something, but also to speak out about something that is out of the mainstream thought.
Jorge?
Yeah, I guess I'll try to summarize my thoughts succinctly, but look, I think the most immediate challenge is what Sorab yesterday called the political economy of publishing, right? Finding a financially sustainable path to publishing and reaching a wide audience, right? That's going to be a huge challenge, and people are tackling it in different ways. Some are sort of subscriber-based models only. Others are getting revenue from all of the other channels that we've mentioned. But that is sort of the most immediate, I think, challenge, right? But I think that if you peel off the first layer of that, if you look underneath, there is also the sort of timeless, perennial challenge of journalism, which is to inform and to entertain, which is to come up with a product that is both informative about the world and entertaining. And I think the journalists and the publications that are that are best tackling this are the ones that find a niche, right? I was thinking about the example of Antonio's magazine, La Gaceta de la Iberosfera in Spain is known for covering Latin America in a very knowledgeable way. They know their journalists know about the politics of all of these countries, and so it's a really useful one-stop point to get information about all of Spanish America. That's just one example. I think generally finding a niche, finding something that makes you special, makes you stand out, is I think part of the magic formula.
Kevin?
So I think one of the biggest challenges is that the digital transformation is not a destination, it's a journey. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is that audience behavior changes year to year. I often joke after the last 3 years, it's not a single black swan, it's an entire flock of them. So it's not just audiences, it's also just economic disruption. And so I think I don't like the Silicon Valley term fail fast. Not only because the editor in me grates at the fact that it's grammatically incorrect. I think it creates a culture where you're given permission to experiment, and not all experiments are going to succeed. I like to think of it as learn quickly. And that is creating a culture where you are running experiments. Every experiment kind of allows you to adapt even better. And that's what the New York Times has done. That's what a lot of successful publishers have done, is that every single step in their digital transformation actually puts another piece into where they need to go next. And I'll just end on this last thought, because I think I want to build on the comments previous, and that is everyone says information wants to be free, but that is a quote taken out of context. The second half is, but it also wants to be expensive. And so the key to this, and again, to build on the distinctiveness and adding value, is what are you doing that's rare and adds value, and that people are going to be willing to support, whether those people are advertisers or subscribers or members. And that's really one of the key questions And sometimes, we fall in love with what we do as journalists. I am still a firm believer in the mission of journalism, but the First Amendment needs a business model, which is a great quote from a chief revenue officer whose name escapes me because I'm still slightly jet-lagged. But that's what I'll leave you is find out what information wants to be expensive, and your success will follow. Thank you.
So thank you. We have a few questions here. One says, screen addiction feels unescapable. Do you think that there's any hope that we'll have a healthier relationship with technology, social media in the future? No? So will we have a healthier relationship with technology or social media in the future? What do you think? Or,
well, I think we as a humankind, we are adapting to all these changes, not only as publishers, editors, or journalists, and we will adapt. I mean, we create more information every year than in centuries, so we have to be patient and we shouldn't be as tough to ourselves as we sometimes are as a species. But from the editor point of view, I think we are. I mean, our relationship is improving. We are being able to manage social media as a channel. We are kind of accepting. It's not about competing in terms of quickness, speed, and we are adapting to make the most of it, or even taking advantage of social media as a tool, as a cheap tool, as I would say, to reach the audience and to bring them to our in-depth content. So I think there are many examples of outlets who are doing great in social media, and not by a coincidence, they are those who are also doing well in terms of audience.
I'm not going to compare it to teen sex. That was covered in the last panel. But it does strike me that social media, and a lot of publishers' relationship to social media is, and I'll only speak for myself, I statements, not you statements, but I can remember as a teenager when I was really had a hard crush on someone, I was constantly fighting for their attention. That's how publishers have been with social media. We've been like besotted teenagers, to use a British phrase. What we need to do is think of this as a business transaction, cold, clear business transaction. We want a slice of that attention, but how do we create value from that attention? So again, conversion funnel. And this is what we did at my previous role is, yes, we posted on Facebook. Then we used Facebook's ad targeting to sign up to a newsletter or a podcast. And then we started to build that relationship that goes to membership. So my whole strategy in my previous role was building loyalty and habit leading to membership. That's it. And I think that, you have to view every single interaction with a third-party supplier, which is what Facebook and Twitter are. They're just supplying attention. View it through that lens, be really cold and calculating about it, and then it won't become the abusive relationship that it has become.
So here is another question. Is crowdfunded or Patreon journalism akin to the membership idea? How would you go about creating this personal bond between supporters and journalists or podcasters?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the earlier point about Substack, and it's not only about Substack. I mean, before Substack, there was, as the question says, Patreon. You could set up an account or a blog or a Medium. You could set up a Medium account, and you could start posting content and giving people the option of helping you out by chipping in on Patreon. Now, I think Substack is. I'm really interested in how Substack is going to evolve as a platform. I mean, it's already incorporated a lot of new additions to the way you can display the content on your page, and it's kind of a very interesting platform because it doubles as a newsletter, right? Every time you post on Substack, an email gets sent to your subscribers, and as an online portal, as a blog. So I think a Substack, I mean, it remains to be seen just how far the revolution is going to go, whether it's going to append existing structures. I think it's certainly working very well for people like Barry Weiss, for instance, who was able to, who I think has, I mean, it's fair to say she's got a much bigger readership on Substack than she did in the New York Times. So I think, and again, I think tying this back to my earlier point, I think Substack should make us journalists, magazine journalists, realize that magazines sit in this very precarious niche in between writers and journalists, and that nothing stops those two groups from connecting unmediated.
Kevin, you also mentioned before that you run a personal newsletter besides Bugsby's. So why is it so helpful? Or
you know what? For me, it's I'm paying attention to these things. It's part of what I do professionally. But I long ago learned the value in sharing some of that attention with other people. And my personal newsletter feeds into the PubPig newsletter, so I can justify it. But sharing that attention that I have on personal media, and I mean, I don't monetize my newsletter, but often my newsletter might get me the next job. And so, you know, there's a little bit of career development with it. There's a little bit of, you know, it feeds into another newsletter. But going back to the Patreon thing, there's so many good examples on Patreon of how people are using it. I went through an information diet during the pandemic, and so I used to just listen to news podcasts, and then I'm like, okay, pandemic plus doing my master's degree plus constant news is making me depressed. I need to sort of lighten up a little bit. So I flipped my podcast listening, and there's, you know, Myths and Legends podcast, which is a great podcast about fractured fairy tales. They thank all of their Patreon contributors at the end of the podcasts, even no matter how silly their usernames are. Thank you, Janice5694. Then Alan Alda, look, he's an actor. He's well known in the US, but he has little meetups, virtual meetups during the pandemic with people. And that was part of your Patreon subscription. So what is that, again, what's that relationship? What's that, you know, sense of belonging that you're going to do through that Patreon subscription, that membership rather, that Patreon membership that brings people closer to you and makes them want to sort of, you know, oh, you're only if you're a premium Patreon subscriber, you get to do our, you know, exclusive Zoom hangout this month, you know. So sorry, I'm you know, I'm a media operator and I'm a creator, and you got to balance them both because you got to eat.
So another question says, journalism is becoming more personal, viral. Individual journalists have an online presence. Does coming off as smaller and more sincere help marketability?
Well, I mean, I tend to think that there's still a lot of value to the editorial footprint of a magazine. I mean, you've got to realize that when you buy a magazine, when you show up at a newsstand, buy a magazine, you're paying for not just the raw copy that the writer sends, you're also paying for the editorial footprint in that piece, right? You're paying for the fact that an editor is sitting in an office and getting the email, sifting through it, and if it piques their interest, editing the piece. That is where the value goes. I think there's still a lot of value to that. I mean, not that independent writers who are publishing on Substack should be disregarded or anything. I mean, I'm sure that self-editing is also a viable way to publish. But I think that ultimately, when you go to a magazine, you know that what they're publishing is good, or it upholds the quality standards of that magazine. Whereas on Substack, if you're searching for newsletters to subscribe to, you don't have that sort of certainty, even though most of the really big ones are good stuff.
So the last question is asking for advice. What advice would you give to an aspiring journalist? It's not specified. So in general, how to become successful in this changing environment?
For a journalist, for a newspaper, magazine?
Probably newspaper, I guess.
Well, it depends on if you want to be just a business or you want to share something that nobody shares. They spoke about niches, and there are many topics that are not covered. There's a very important option. I think it is fantastic that personal blogs, magazines, and newspapers coexist. From an editor point of view, it is a huge, perfect, deep source of talent. Blogs are very talented people writing blogs without support, without an editor, without marketing, and it is a perfect way to put together the talent and the support to find it. So a good way is to start a blog. If you have talent, probably you will be found easily. But if you are an outlet, I think it's important. I mean, I won't say the opposite I said before at the beginning. If you're an outlet and if you have an idea of how the world is, no matter what, stick faithful to truth. Don't think about too much about advertisers, because it will come. We are living, and Hungary is a perfect example of this, that normal people is realizing they are not alone. They've been tired for a long time, and they are in search of outlets, of voices that say the same they say, and they are there. So if we are at that side or close to them, just keep that in mind and be faithful that things will work out. And it's not self-help, it is experience.
Jorge?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. It's very funny. I submitted the same question in a panel yesterday on Slido, so I'm going to try to answer my own question. I think so. Two things. I think first, never stop doing things. I mean, read widely, travel as much as you can, speak to people, get in front of people, build sources, do interviews, do book reviews, do essays, do op-eds. So do as much stuff as you can. And the other point is about, again, what Saurabh called the political economy, how to make it financially sustainable. And I think the key for, say, a young freelancer or a young writer for a magazine, for that matter, mostly actually this applies to freelancers, it's very hard to gain a foothold early on, a financially sustainable one early on. So sometimes this is an advice that I've been given by people who are better placed than me, but in the early stages, I think young writers should focus on getting their name out rather than, or that should override the need to be financially sustainable. The primary focus should be, for a young writer, get out there, get as many bylines out as possible, write as much as possible, write for different magazines, varying magazines, and then it will work. You have to hope it will work out. And for a lot of people, it does end up working out. But I think in those early stages, you have to really focus on, let me establish myself, let me get my name out as much as possible, and the financials will sort themselves out eventually.
So as someone who, in my media days, was almost constantly recruiting, I'll tell you a few things of what I looked for. And first of all, I echo the point that you don't have to wait until someone gives you your first job. You can start a blog on WordPress.com tomorrow and start building a portfolio. Now, one thing I would say, especially if you're going to be a newspaper journalist or you're going to work in that world, one of the things that has happened in successive rounds of cuts is that the strategic management is hollowed out. And so when we were hiring, and this was quite honestly a big ask, we were asking our junior staff to be much more strategic thinkers than I ever was at 18, 19, 20, 25. The people who I sort of hired versus the people who just kind of became a resume were the people who actually approached it strategically. So and let me give you exactly what I mean, so that, because it's probably not something that is in your curriculum right now. If I have someone who says, I launched a newsletter, great initiative, box ticked. If someone says, I launched a newsletter and did A/B testing and found that my readers liked headlines that referred to this topic or touched on this or used these words 25% more than when I used other words, I'm like, okay, that's somebody to hire. Because they're already thinking strategically about reaching an audience. Because I will say, going back and sort of wrapping this all up and kind of, is that one of the big changes in media has become, it's easy to launch a publication, it's hard to build audience, and it's even harder to build a sustainable business. So if you know, I don't, you know, to the point everybody else has made, I don't expect you to say, hey, in the first year I made $100,000. No, that's not going to happen. But if you start thinking critically about what you're producing and how to build an audience around that, that's what I would look for in a young journalist.
So thank you. So this is the end of our panel discussion. I would like to thank you once again, our speakers, Kevin, Jorge, and Antonio, for being here, and also our audience. Thank you, and goodbye.